And we're back, and so are you. Thank you for tuning in to another installment of How's This, a series of programs where we're trying to have a bit of a public conversation about how we live here in Newton, Massachusetts, and how the next generation here is going to be confronting some big issues. Three of us are here today for a bit of conversation. Mark Hirschman, Robert Fizek, and me, I'm Jeff Stein. All three of us are architects, and so, we have reasons to try to think clearly about Newton and building, about our shared history here, and our shared worry about what might come next. That next thing could be a big bunch of multifamily housing, something rather new for Newton, but overall, not exactly a new idea. Humans have been making it since the Roman Empire. So Mark, you know a little bit about the Roman Empire. You've brought some images. Show us something.
Well, I would have loved to live back then, but we've been looking at the development of multifamily housing, and the Roman insulae is a key component and the first element that we could see historically that led to the development of the multifamily housing type, and in turn, actually, the apartment building. So here's an image of what's called the insulae, and its organization reflected the need of the Roman community to the development of a merchant class. So you had retail on the first floor, and the owners of the retail would live on the main floor, which is above the mezzanine, and then you'd have upper levels, and even back then were called apartments, and they were for the lower class, as one would say, the poorer class, and the units reflected that. The hazards, the amount of ventilation, the lack of facilities was a very egregious typology, but this community functioned up to 1 million people in Rome at its height, and they packed them in these insulae throughout the center of Rome.
So two things about this. One is that these are poor people that live in these apartments.
Exactly.
And the other is, this is not out in the suburbs somewhere. This isn't in a garden city. It's not in a leafy suburb. This is in urbanized downtown Rome, Italy, a big city. And this is big city housing. Correct.
It was a paradigm of a growing society where they had a merchant class and they packed everybody tightly, and it was a paradigm that in its time worked for Rome at its time.
So this also demonstrated a kind of a divide, a class divide among people in Rome, but that wasn't particularly a problem quite the way it seems to be in America right now.
The divide was glaring, and I think it's questionable whether that divide is here as well in a way. So you had the upper levels of minimal-sized dwellings that packed people together tightly to serve a society, an economic system. And amazingly enough, I think we could actually say that class divide and that typology is perhaps with us today. Still with us today. And we really have to unravel that, and is it an appropriate paradigm to continue?
So multifamily, although apartment building is probably a better word for it, and And why are we talking about this?
Well, because it is so relevant to today. Because actually we have this typology, and we're going to go through some slides and examine the typology back then in Rome and through other particular slices of history briefly, how it speaks to us and what it really says about where it came from. Is it still relevant, and why are we still doing this type?
So here we're seeing plans of an apartment building in Rome with a kind of a courtyard in the middle, but with apartments and rooms packed around it.
Right, and that type is not that different than what we are still building today. We're a lot further, 2,000 years beyond the time of Rome, and still creating types quite like this. If it was an ideal, perfect type worth emulating, perhaps we can applaud it. We could applaud it for its time, for the society and the type of economic model that they were living in at that time. But is that relevant today? And we have perhaps a changing paradigm on how people live and work and where. And that's what we can all talk about.
Good. Show us another.
All right. So this is a closer view of typical plan. You can see what's already a corridor, and so there are two sides of it. A little bit of court or room, and minimal stairs. And even then, the safety issue of stairs and egress was a major concern. There were serious fires in these structures. They were 4, 5, 6 stories, some. And today, we're talking about in the building codes to actually reduce the number of stairs needed in multi-family housing. They say, okay, we have sprinklers and so forth, but if they fail, the tradition, at least over the last few decades, has been 2 egresses, and there are now instances where developers are encouraging building departments and plan reviewers to allow them 1 egress to a multi-unit situation.
So now we're looking at a picture of the Stuyvesant in New York, again an inner city kind of apartment building, and there's a big gap between Rome and, well, the 19th century, in which things evolve but don't change that much until the Industrial Revolution. And now we have people who own things and workers. And the workers need housing, and somehow we've decided that that housing, not houses themselves, but housing, is going to be apartments.
Very true. The interesting thing, if you look back 2,000 years to Rome, those units were rental, and they called them tenements. So this type had been 2,000 years, and we haven't shedded that paradigm because it's efficient to build. Rome was able to pack 1 million in their small walled city area, and why we are still doing it, we did it for industrialization. But I think as we talk further along in this show, is that paradigm paramount, and do we need to continue that paradigm? The interesting thing about the Stuyvesant building, and we will talk about that at a later date in greater detail, is this was a rare example of transcending the tenement type, and they were trying to replicate a home above grade. And so the units in the Stuyvesant and the Dakota, which again we will look at at later date, replicated or tried to replicate the concept of home. In other words, they were more spacious. There were fewer of them per floor. They had separate entrance to the ground plane. And that's why they were called luxury or more opulent. But if that was the paradigm going forward, perhaps we would have a different type today, but that did not continue.
It sounds a little expensive.
Exactly. So we could continue with some of these other images. Here's an image of the New York tenement. Continuous, their party wall, all very much the same, requiring the fire egress on the outside. And here we can look at the layout. Again, we're showing architectural plans. Spend a little time, get close to your screen, see if you could take a closer look. But already you could see in the third from the right, you could see the development of the corridor. And we saw that in the Roman type. And we know historically the problems with the tenement. The lack of light, too many units per floor, access to facilities, and we know the history, and again, we will further elaborate on the problems of the tenement.
This is a really interesting picture, and you should remember seeing it, in which there's a corridor, and then there are apartments on one side, apartments on the other side, and just this lengthy hall. So what people are sharing in this kind of condition is a long, dark corridor, and that's about it.
Yeah. Actually, they went backwards. Instead of having a courtyard with light and air flowing from inside to outside and through, you now have a corridor that's entirely enclosed by all the spaces around it and no flow of air because it's all closed up with doors.
But it's easier to build, right, and cheaper.
Cheap, sure.
The point you made is so well taken. So what you're actually pointing out, 2,000 years ago, the Roman paradigm was at least trying to be better. And we gave up that component.
Yeah. And that may have been, the illustration you had may have been sort of a middle class version, or upper middle class, because I lived in Rome for a time, and I think there were probably more like these sorts of New York tenement style arrangements, because at least in my building, which was quite old, I'm sure, the courtyard was very small.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very, very
But
small.
it did bring in some light and pigeons.
Yes.
So in 2023, why are we talking about this? Well, it's Newton's law, right? Isaac Newton's third law of motion. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. And what was the action? Well, the Massachusetts state legislature has suggested, and it's more than a suggestion, that we all get together and build 360,000 new units of multifamily housing in eastern Massachusetts over the next generation. Some in every town that's served by the MBTA. Sounds like fun, doesn't it? And it's transformative, too. This at a time when the state has lost population over the last two census takings, and at a time when the workplace has changed significantly, too. So here's an example, Robert. When you make architectural projects, where do you do it?
I do it in my home.
So you have a home office. And Mark Hirschman, you have a firm, MSH Architects, and where's that located?
Also in the home.
Oh, you guys are working
Home-based.
for home. Sounds like a new kind of Me Too movement, because my work also comes from home. And my plumber, when I need him, is headquartered in his home too, out near Concord. Restaurants are there. Oh, and most people are buying things over the internet anyway. And so this idea of multifamily housing in the suburbs in all of eastern Massachusetts, 360,000 units over the next generation. Things have changed. But governments, whether they're federal or regional or local, are slow to catch up with this stuff. Rather than recognize the changes, the legislature imagines we can garage people in apartments, we'll collect big property tax, and we'll let those people take the T into work into the city. Although, as we record this program, Boston has about a 20% vacancy rate currently, and it's only getting worse. Newton's share of these 360,000 units is 8,000 apartments. That's going to change the town a little bit.
A lot. The paradigm you're talking about, it's incredible, truly incredible that while we're discussing how people can work more remotely, not only are they still trying to build apartment buildings in the city when the demand is rather we can be further out. What we should be trying to encourage is where people want to live, how they would like to live, and not keep feeding the paradigm, this is the typology we are building for you, the masses. And so they're exporting that paradigm that was in the city, and they're saying, wow, we could also do it in the suburbs too.
That was an interesting idea that was around at the turn of the last century, 125 years ago, which was the notion of mass. That masses of people would live in mass housing, and they would go to the same sorts of work and at the same time, and so we would need mass transit. And in fact, we're celebrating the 125th anniversary of Massachusetts's mass transit right now, and yet during COVID, over a couple of years, America lost 1/3 of its commuters. That is to say, 5 years ago, there were 160 million Americans who commuted into work on a daily basis. Now, today, there are only about 100 million. We lost 1/3 of them. And where did that third go? Well, like the three of us, most of them are working from home now, living wherever they want to live, not in central cities, not next to train stations where they can easily take the train into the city because they're not going in anymore. Or, like us, baby boomers, the largest generation of workers ever in the world, they're leaving their jobs altogether and retiring and not bothering with taking mass transit anywhere. And so this idea of urbanizing the whole of eastern Massachusetts is a sort of a tough nut to swallow.
It's an incorrect paradigm. Very interesting. Key component of the working remote as architects is what do you need in your home to practice and to do your profession remotely, or what would you like? And we speak of colleagues who weren't prepared for this, and what did they have to do? Transform their dining room to both an office and a dining room. So those that went through that experience, they would say, it's okay going back to the office, because they didn't have the spaces to continue that on a long term. But so what could we as architects, planners, developers, and the public be asking and pleading for? More space in the dwelling.
And so, even as we make apartments, the ones that have been made so far and the ones that are being planned for, when we've seen plans and talked to people who are developing these, we don't see that kind of work going on. We don't see that kind of space being made, nor the connection which is really lovely where I work, to nature. I can go out and sit under a tree if I want to and design what I'm going to design. And it's a lovely experience that ought to be available to pretty much everybody, and in fact is, if we don't garage them all in multifamily housing.
Right. It should almost, we should declare, like in so many other things, a human right. That the human condition, what do we really crave as humans on the planet? Air, grass, trees, nature, and in a place to participate in the world. If we could bring something to the world, to be an individual, to create a family, and to be able to say that I and my group is unique and special, and not just garaged in a multi-unit apartment building with anonymous doors down an anonymous corridor where you're really not going to socialize in a corridor that's just a few feet wide.
Good. So we've lived through the Roman Empire, made it until the Industrial Revolution, and what's going on in Russia at the turn of the last century?
Well, it's amazing. In and around World War II, leadership from Stalin to Khrushchev were looking to bring the masses to the cities for industrialization and productivity, so to speak. So what did they do? They packed them in what was called Kruschyevkas. And these are housing blocks. And if you could put it on the screen, and we could enjoy looking at their creation. And if you meet Russians that have emigrated here to the States, they can all reminisce about what this cruel type of dwelling was, where the minimal size units were incredibly tight. These are in meters, and you could see the scale. You could see in some of the rooms a double beds with a little table between, a kitchen that's less than an alley kitchen, and living is just a sofa and table and chairs.
Good. Can we see that image?
Yeah. And there you go. This type was prevalent, and this was for extended families, or more than one family in one of these units. And even for one family, it's what we might call today micro units.
So, like a tenement in New York, you get one window on one end of a room, and the other end is facing the corridor.
Absolutely.
The Kruschyevka dwelling units in the Soviet Union and after World War II. And so, what are we doing here in Newton these days?
Okay. So here you can see the housing block, the double-loaded corridor, the anonymous impersonal corridor in the middle. And here are American examples, Pruitt-Igoe, and historically you can look at interesting history about how these were demolished. Also, all around the world that was a typology that was being built. But here we are back in Newton.
Oh, this is 2023, and this is what we're building in Newton for multifamily housing. The same industrial Kruschyevka apartments that were done in Moscow, the same in India, the same in Kenya, a long corridor, narrow apartments, one window looking out. Really? Are you kidding me?
It's quite incredible.
This reminds me, by the way, since Newton has lost population too. They've lost 8,000 people in the last 5-10 years. And so the question is, like that baseball movie, Field of Dreams, if you build it, they'll come.
That's the problem. If that's the paradigm you present to the public, they feel they don't have a choice. And that's our responsibility as in the public from architects, developers, people that work in government, and the public to speak up. We don't really need this. We want nature, we want air, we want to have enough place in which to live.
Oh yeah, you know, in America, 50% of the carbon in the atmosphere comes from buildings. Not from cars or jet planes, but it comes from constructing and maintaining buildings. And so now we're going to triple our carbon footprint by building 360,000 new units of buildings. Yikes.
We can mesh with nature much better.
Well, we hope so. And we're going to talk about how we might mesh with nature much better over the next few iterations of How's This? Thank you for tuning in today, and we look forward to seeing you again.